First, thank Karen for accepting the invitation. This is one lecture related to Papoconnexus initiative. Papoconnexus provides a nexus perspective to promote understanding of interdependence between water, energy, and food sectors, influencing policies in other areas as well, such as climate and biodiversity. The next perspective seeks solutions to involve multiple disciplines, thus escaping from knowledge silos, enabling the identification of mutually beneficial response and foster the potential for cooperation across all sectors. It's necessary to think and act from the perspective that all sectors are interconnected and to realize the full impact of the direct, indirect synergies of these connections. So understanding this nexus is key to meeting the growing demands of society without compromising sustainability. This approach will allow decision makers to develop appropriate policy strategies and investments, exploring synergy, identifying mitigating trade-offs among sustainable development goals related to water, energy, and food security. Okay, this is kind of a background of Papoconnexus, and without further ado, I'll introduce Karen Ryberg. She's a researcher at US Geological Survey in North Dakota. She has a degree in mathematics and master's in statistics and PhD in environmental science. I hope I gave the right relations. So she's going to talk about a lot of things related to flood frequency analysis that is has been developed in the US for the last decade or few years. And Karen, I'm not going to talk more, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. I'm really pleased to be here to talk to all of you today. I'm going to talk about a number of studies the USGS has done since Bulletin 17C came out. And Bulletin 17C is the federal United States guidance for flood frequency analysis. And we probably have a pretty diverse audience, so I'll talk a little bit too about what flood frequency analysis really is. Some of these studies I'm summarizing, I was very involved in, others not so much, but they kind of go together, complement each other. So I'll try to give some credit to my colleagues as well. A little bit more about Bulletin 17C.
Karen, just a second, sorry to interrupt, but you displaying the other screen.
Okay.
There is a way to switch.
Yes. How's that?
Yes,
okay.
Fine.
Okay, good. Okay, so Bulletin 17C are the federal guidelines, and they came out in 2018, much anticipated. It had been a long time since there was an update, and many brilliant people involved in this, including Jerry Stedinger, who is in the audience today, John England, Beth Faber from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Tim Cohn, Andrea Bayou, Julie Kang, Robert Mason from the USGS, and Will Thomas, who's retired from the USGS, but has a career in engineering consulting. So some really smart people, Julie Kang, Robert Mason, have been mentors of mine. And there were a lot of other people involved behind the scenes. And it has some important advancements, including a generalized representation of flood data that allows interval and censored data. So we can incorporate things like historical peak stream flow, paleo floods, values when we know perhaps the stream gauge was overtopped and we know it's above a certain level. We can incorporate those peaks with more uncertainty into flood frequency analysis and thereby extend the flood frequency record, which is great. They also identified needs, quite a few needs for future studies. Some we've been working on trying to address, and there's much more room for research, including things like mixed populations when you have different generating mechanisms. Some of your peaks are snow melt, some of your floods are rain summer thunderstorm generated at the same site, for example. What do you do at sites where you don't have a stream gauge? How do we better estimate floods there? And changes in watershed processes, climate, land use change, how would you inform flood frequency analysis with that? And, addressing things like regulated flow, urbanization. And so a little bit more about flood frequency analysis. If you are not familiar with this, you get a record of peak stream flow at a stream gauge. And so generally in the United States, we use what is called the annual peak stream flow value. And that is the highest value recorded at that gauge every year. It may or may not be a flood. If you have a very dry year, maybe the river never goes outside its banks. So your peak value can be actually quite small. But in the long term, we hope that this encompasses the variability at that site, the hydrologic regime. Of course, the more data, the better to do this, but oftentimes we're doing this on short periods of record. This is a site it actually has the longest record of peak flow that I know of in North America. And it's actually the Red River of the North at Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. And so you fit this to a statistical distribution and you plot it. And this red line here is an estimate of the flood magnitude for various annual exceedance probabilities. So if you have a 1% annual exceedance probability, the 1% flood AEP, also the so-called 100-year flood, the flood that's so large that in the very long term, it would only occur once every 100 years. And there's some other things, we're going to come back to this site, so I won't talk about everything here, but one of the advancements in Bulletin 17C is addressing these low peaks. Because when you have these really low values, they can skew the fit of this statistical distribution. And really, these we can handle with our infrastructure. We're not worried about these. We're more worried about the peaks on the upper end, where the y-axis here is annual peak discharge. So the methods defined in Bulletin 17C censor some low values, and therefore they're discounted somewhat in the fit of this distribution. So you can focus on the upper end where we really are concerned about getting a good estimate of flood magnitude for various recurrence intervals. So there are many issues when doing this. You have to pick a statistical distribution. And speaking to an audience like this, it's hard to know how much people know about statistics, but you may know about the normal distribution, which is symmetric bell-shaped curve. It's defined by a central point, the mean, and then variance, standard deviation, how far the distribution spreads out. In the United States, we use the log of the Pearson type 3 distribution, which is defined by 3 parameters: the mean, the variance, and a skew. So generally peak stream flow is not symmetric, bell-shaped, it's skewed, could be right or left skewed. And skew is a big topic in itself in flood frequency analysis. But other countries use other distributions. There's many distributions that could be used to fit this data and make these estimates. And then there are methods for performing the fit. So we will touch on those things a little bit. So I'm going to talk about some work that's been done to estimate very low annual exceedance probabilities, those so-called 1,000, 10,000 and beyond flood, the super big floods, and incorporating paleo and historical floods in flood frequency analysis. Excuse me, the technical review of studies with paleo and historical floods, because there's a much greater degree of uncertainty and you need to do a lot of review of those estimates and the methods used to incorporate them, attribution of changes in flooding, and then non-stationary flood frequency analysis. And in the flood frequency community, non-stationarity is a term that you will hear frequently. And it's a statistical property of a series. And in the case of annual peak stream flow, it's that the long-term distributional properties, the mean, variance, or skew, change one or more times, either gradually or abruptly. So traditionally, the assumption of flood frequency analysis is that if you have a long, relatively long period of record, those peaks should vary with around a particular mean within a given window of variance. But as we learn more, we know that things are not that simple. There are many sites that just naturally have some non-stationarity to them. And then of course, there's land use change, climate change. And then also, given the interests of Papoconnexus and talking about this a little bit in advance, I wanted to make clear what the role of the USGS is. We are a non-regulatory agency, so we don't operate any dams. We don't tell people how to operate dams. We do the science. We can provide guidelines, tools, and then the decision and implementation is left up to other federal, tribal, state, local agencies. Much of our work is done in cooperation with other agencies at all levels. And then I work for a water science center, and those are scattered across the country. And much of our work is a reimbursable model. We don't just get funding from the federal government to do this. We have to go out and find funding. We have some matching funds, and we need partners to help pay for this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that we did in cooperation with the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And I was kind of excited to work with the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. That wasn't really something I had thought of in my career, but when you working for a nuclear agency, but when you think about their issues of long-term storage of nuclear waste, they have many, many risks to be concerned about, and flooding is a big one. And they are concerned about not just the 100-year flood, but the flood that is so big that 100 years ago, it wasn't even on our radar, but we still have nuclear waste stored and need to protect for it. And they are very good at incorporating all kinds of risks, even if there's great uncertainty, into models. So, so they can look at the risk of floodwaters getting near the plant, and then the risk of waters moving through their flood barriers, and then the risk of floodwaters moving through seals in the plant, all kinds of risk. So they funded a couple studies related to very low annual exceedance probability estimation. And this goes up to what you could call the million-year flood, which raises lots of philosophical questions. A million years from now, will the river even be there? There'll be so much change, but they have to do something to estimate very large floods. And my colleague, William Asquith, along with Julie Kang and Tim Cohn, did this work. And so we have uncertainty because we only have so much period of record at a site. We don't know necessarily what the largest flood possible is there, and we can do some work to try to determine the potential largest flood to occur. But then when you do this analysis, there are all kinds of other forms of uncertainty, including what distribution do you pick? And how does that affect uncertainty for your flood magnitude? And then what is the fitting method you use? EMA, the expected moments algorithm, is the one in bulletin 17C, but there are other options. And he looked at 2 sites here. So it's, just a limited case study. And there's extended output option in the USGS peak FQ software for very low annual exceedance probabilities. And then the report goes through some interesting things. One, it used the Pearson type 3 statistical distribution to fit the peaks, but then used different fitting methods that are available, and then looked at the uncertainty with different estimates of flood magnitude. And this doesn't show the error bounds on it. So each of these is fitting the data to the same statistical distribution, but different fitting methods. And if you look at the 100-year flood, they're all pretty close together. But if you go way out into the tails, the extremes, and you could question how realistic this big increase is. We don't really know, but if we use the data we have to estimate this, you can see there's more divergence based on the fitting method. So this is another source of uncertainty when you're doing flood frequency analysis. The other thing he looked at is if you fit them with all the same method, but you use different statistical distributions, and he included all these different statistical distributions, what are the different flood frequency curves you get? And you can see there is a huge difference here. And, you know, for frequent low values, some of these obviously are better than others, but there's not a huge difference. But even before we get to the 100-year flood, there is great divergence here. So when you look at the literature for flood frequency analysis across the world, there's some people that use the GEV, some use the Pearson type 3. Some of these others get used. Some of them have 3 parameters to estimate the central tendency, the shape, the spread of the data. Some use 5 parameters. And it's kind of amazing. This is just one site, but that is a big topic in hydrology. And if you don't have peaks out here like historical or paleo flood peaks to really check your model, some of these you can throw out, but others it's really hard to know which is the correct distribution. So this is a very interesting report summarizing some of these issues, again at just 2 sites, but very good information to look at if you do flood frequency analysis. And then for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, we did this was kind of a follow-up to that report that I did along with Kelsey Kohlers, Julie Kang, Meredith Carr. She was with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and now she's with the Corps of Engineers. And they were interested in 2 issues. This really should have been 2 reports, but we got it all into one. A literature review of non-stationarity issues. How do you detect them? How might you address them? And then looking at these very low annual exceedance probability floods, but incorporating historical and paleo flood data to see how that might affect our estimates. So the literature review, Bulletin 17C relies on this assumption of stationarity, that the peaks are independent, identically distributed, lack any long-term persistence or autocorrelation, the mean, the variance, the skew are not changing over time. And as more information becomes available, we know that at many sites, naturally, there's a long-term persistence, some switches between wet and dry conditions, climate change, land use change. So this is a big issue, an active issue in flood frequency analysis research. And then the ability to put paleo and historical flood data using the expected moments algorithm was a really cool improvement in our flood frequency techniques. We can put non-standard flood data using the expected moments algorithm, including flood intervals, flood thresholds. We can put in some estimates for missing data, and it again extends the flood record. And we can do things like we know a flood occurred that was between 5,000 and 7,000 CFS, maybe based on accounts in a newspaper and where it was on a bridge in the past. We can get a rough estimate compared to a gauge. We can put in greater thans, less thans, and so on. And then historical peaks, we differentiate between the paleo flood peaks and the historical peaks. The paleo flood leaves some physical evidence in the sediment, in scour. Historical peaks are things that come from newspaper accounts. And there's a lot of work that could still be done to document some historical peaks based on accounts. And even things like when someone says in 1888, this was the largest flood since 1876. If you're confident in that information, maybe find multiple lines of evidence, you can incorporate that into flood frequency analysis. And we do know that oftentimes these are biased. They are biased to large floods, otherwise they wouldn't be in the newspaper. But there's also been some work to show that the newspapers sometimes exaggerated the accounts because they're in the business of selling newspapers. So you hope that you can find multiple lines of evidence, such as a level it reached on a bridge and so on. And then again, the Paleoflood data, floodplain terraces, slack water deposits, flood bars, tree scars, tree ring anomalies, erosional scars. So the Red River to the north at Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, I think is one of the coolest records of annual peak stream flow in North America, certainly. It is a very long-term gauge. This was a Hudson's Bay Trading Company. It's where French fur trappers and traders and English fur trappers and traders had posts, and they kept very detailed diaries. So in terms of the interior northern part of the continent, it was settled earlier than some places. And then it was settled by business people that had an interest in the level of the river, because that was their transportation route. There's some large historic flood points estimated by the Canadian Department of Resources and Development, and those estimates are considered to be very good. And then a historian has scoured all these fur trapper and trader diaries, provincial records, and so on to estimate a number of historic flood intervals. Because the people at Hudson's Bay Company would say, like, April 17th, the Red River exceeded its banks. So there's a lot of detailed information. And then work has also been done using tree rings and anomalies in the tree rings to identify very large flood years. And we know that the largest flood in 350 years was in 1826. So I'm going to show you some things related to this. And some of these are from the USGS software, PeakFQ, that you would use to do this flood frequency analysis. And so these are our gauged peaks going back into the 1870s at this site. And there are some missing years, but based on what we know, all the historical work that's been done, I am confident that if those peaks had exceeded 60,000 CFS, they would have been recorded. There would be an estimate here. So we can put in a threshold that says, if the flood was 60,000 CFS to infinity, we would have recorded a peak. Therefore, we know these are less than values, less than 60,000 CFS. And that can be incorporated into flood frequency analysis. And we get this flood frequency curve that we looked at before. Another cool thing with Bulletin 17C methods is the use of PILFs, potentially influential low flows. And these are the points I mentioned before that are low flows. We are not as interested in fitting the distribution to these. The interesting thing at this site is it is known for having serial correlation, memory in the system, which is a violation of the underlying assumptions of flood frequency analysis. But how bad does that violation have to be before you can't do flood frequency analysis? That's been an ongoing question at the site. But one of the things about these PILFs is that we have these persistent dry conditions. You know, around the 1930s, the Dust Bowl of North America, the Great Drought, these are temporally related. They are not just random low flows. These generally represent that dry period. So we also have a change point in here, an abrupt change in the distribution from relatively dry to relatively wet conditions, which is also a violation of flood frequency analysis assumptions. But the PILFs kind of take care of that by censoring these values and not making them as influential. If we incorporate all of the historical and paleo information we can get here, we can go back into the just a little bit before 1650. We have some points that were well estimated by the Canadian government. We have these interval estimates done by this historian, and then we have some estimates based on tree rings and this paleoflood evidence. We're fairly certain that from 1650 to a little bit before the 1800s, there were only 2 floods this big. And so these values are censored. They're less than like 105,000 CFS. And then based on all these historical accounts where there were a lot of people in the area writing diaries, we know that in these years with these interval estimates, if there is not a flood estimate, the flood, we're pretty confident, was less than 60,000 CFS. So we have gone from this, for North America, a pretty long gauge record already, to a much longer record. In terms of paleo flooding, there are many studies that can go back much further than this when you get paleo data. The Red River, the North Basin, is one of the youngest land surfaces on the face of the earth because of the last glaciation. And then there was a persistent glacial meltwater lake there, Lake Agassiz. So it is a very flat basin. It's one of the flattest surfaces on the face of the earth, and it's actually still experiencing isostatic rebound at the northern end, which is where the land is still raising up after the weight of the glaciation was removed. So flattest place on the earth is actually getting a little bit flatter because of that isostatic rebound at the northern end. But we add all of these in, we do flood frequency analysis, and all of these gray lines represent that interval censoring. And we've extended a little bit higher what we have observed in the flood analysis. And our points fit pretty well within the error bounds for determining our flood magnitudes for various annual exceedance probabilities. So then how does this impact the very low annual exceedance probability floods? I spent a lot of time on this, and I did this at some other sites as well, but I did the most on the Red River in the north at Winnipeg because of this rich data set, including historical and paleo flood peaks, and because of other research. So I did all these flood frequency under all these different scenarios. There's a dry period and there's a wet period. And one of the reasons for doing that is because in flood frequency analysis, you have to be worried about your sample. Is your sample representative of the entire hydrologic regime, or did you happen to sample during a really wet period? Maybe you have 30 years of data, 50 years of data, but it happens to be under relatively wet conditions. Or is your sample representative of a dry condition? In the United States, the Colorado River, there's a lot of water use concern on that. And when the water use allocation was done to numerous states in the United States based on the Colorado River, was done based on 40 years of data. And humans, we thought we knew a lot based on 40 years of data. And it turns out that was one of the driest periods since the 1400s. So, that's one of the reasons for doing these comparisons. What if our sample is not very representative of long-term conditions? And then gradually adding in more historical paleo flood data. And then a big topic that I'm not going to get into too much is the estimate of skew in flood frequency analysis. The skew, how the tails behave of your data, can be very influenced by your sample. So oftentimes that skew is weighted by other sites in the area to try to get a more generalized skew. So we looked at that a little bit. So I looked at a number of annual exceedance probabilities, but this is the 0.01 annual exceedance probability, or the 1% flood, or the so-called 100-year flood. And I looked at all of these different scenarios and the error bounds. And so some of these I want to point out. If I just take the most recent 30 years of data, which some people have suggested because of the concern about climate change, land use change, if I take the recent data, that should be most representative of future. Huge error bounds and a large point estimate. That's scenario 5. So if I just take the wet period, that is scenario 4. And that estimate isn't too bad in comparison to some other ones, but it's shorter period of record, more uncertainty. Scenario 1 is just a systematic period of record with at-site skew. I add a weighted skew, goes down a little bit. And then I start adding in more paleo flood data. And by the time I get to scenario 9 here, I've got the paleo and historical estimates in there. I've got those thresholds for years where there weren't observations, but we're pretty sure they would have been recorded had they existed. Scenario 9 is in line with some other estimates. It has lower, narrower confidence bounds than some of these others because it involves much more data, a longer period of record. And then scenario 10 uses a weighted skew. Error bounds are narrow here, but if you look at the plots of the fit, the weighted skew is not as good at this site. And try not to get into skew too much, but I think the reason for that is if you look at all of the sites around this one that would go into a weighted skew, they're much smaller basins. This is the big site, and I think weighted skew doesn't work as well. And then all of these are other published studies that have estimated the 100-year flood under a variety of methods. And you can see there's some variability there. But one thing that stands out to me here, flood frequency studies should be required to publish the error bounds because we don't know how big the error bounds were on some of these. So it was interesting to see how and when these line up. This green dashed line is what is considered to be the largest flood in 350 years, that 1826 flood. So all our estimates are well below that, that's good, but we see under this most recent 30 years and the wet period that the error bounds go beyond that. If we go to the 1,000-year flood, and compare them to the 350-year flood. I don't have other studies to compare this to, but we can see quite a bit of difference in the estimates. And by the time you get up to scenario 9, this is an estimate that includes the paleo, the historical flood data, the thresholds. You can see it has narrower error bounds than most of the others. So hopefully that information, even though there's a lot of uncertainty in estimating a flood this big, is helping us better define that flood. And then we went to this annual exceedance probability. It's kind of an intellectual exercise, and just the uncertainty is huge. When you just use the systematic period of record, the uncertainty is less than some of these others. But when you add in some of these big floods and get a better sense of what's happening at the upper end of the distribution, we get some massive error bounds. But the Nuclear Regulatory Commission felt that this is still useful information for them. They can handle these kinds of uncertainties. So continuing on, non-stationarity is where you have violations of the underlying assumptions. Change points, persistent wet or dry periods, trends, that's an active area of research. Paleo data can sometimes help define the upper bounds of this, but at some other sites I looked at, sometimes the paleo floods just seem like they are from an entirely different population and get even bigger error bounds. Sometimes they go to infinity or cannot be resolved by the software. So paleo flood data doesn't always add to certainty. And then when you think about this long term, you're making a lot of assumptions about the channel and climate. Is that historical paleo flood still relevant today? I think that's a big question in how we move forward addressing non-stationarity and trying to get a long period of record. Then for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, we had a Paleoflood Workshop in their headquarters in Rockville, Maryland. And we brought together people from federal agencies, universities, private consultants to gather technical input and guidance from experts on paleo and historical floods in the interest of creating a guidance document. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, when they get a licensee for a nuclear power plant or someone has to update their license, may be presented with a paleo flood study, and they wanted to know how to be able to judge whether or not this is adequate, done properly. So it's a very interesting group, a small but very interesting group of people involved. And again, this goes back to Bulletin 17C, and this is a nice figure from there that explains how you can incorporate these thresholds, historical periods, paleoflood periods. Maybe you don't have specific floods defined above some of these periods, but you know, based on your paleo or historical study, it's very likely that if the flood was above these values, it would have been recorded. And then this can also be used in more recent years. Sometimes a stream gauge is discontinued because of a lack of funding. That's an issue with US Geological Survey stream gauges. Funding varies over time, and sometimes we lose a gauge, but you can incorporate some uncertainty there if you're confident that if a flood had been above a particular level, it would have been in the news, it might have been added to the USGS database anyway. You can incorporate that uncertainty on both ends of the distribution. And we talked about software that can do this. There's the USGS Peak FQ software, the Corps of Engineers, HEC SSP has software that can do this. And we had panel discussions on all of these topics, botanical evidence, sedimentological evidence, flow reconstruction, all kinds of things. The need for database, a good database for paleo and historical floods. USGS Peak Streamflow database has some floods in there, historical floods in it, but completely insufficient when it comes to metadata to help you understand better the uncertainty at that site. And then the goal was to come up with this review guidelines document to summarize techniques and how to evaluate things and different levels of studies. So it included paleo stage indicators, high water marks, all these different methods in which you could find evidence of floods on the landscape, which is certainly not my area of expertise. So it was very interesting to hear about this. We talked about terrace and floodplain deposits, uncertainties associated with these, and then historical peaks. In we have a report, and one of the sections of the report I wrote was this example on the Red River again, but this is the Red River in the border of North Dakota and Minnesota. The river flows north into Canada, so Winnipeg, the site we looked at earlier, is the downstream larger volume site. But there is a lot of historical evidence for large floods just outside our instrumental period of record in the Fargo-Moorhead area. And so we talked a little bit about, here's some example newspaper accounts, USGS report accounts, historical photographs. If you can figure out the elevation of that bridge and how far it went up on the bridge, there's some excellent photographs of floods in the 1880s and 1890s. We had a dendrochronology expert there. And so many of us are familiar with using tree rings, the width of tree rings to look at wet and dry years, and it's been used to estimate precipitation and stream flow. But you can find flood-related anomalies, which are this circular pattern, and you compare it to trees that haven't been flooded, and when they experience a severe flood, there are anomalies in the vesicles. So Scott St. George at the University of Minnesota is an expert at that. And he is the one that defined some of the paleo flood peaks on the Red River in Canada. We talked about hydraulic analysis. You know, you get a stage based on some form of physical evidence, but then how do you estimate the flow? That is an additional source of uncertainty. And then how do you incorporate all this into historical and paleo flood analysis, which I've already talked a little bit about, but how you think about incorporating that. And then the Nuclear Regulatory Commission wanted levels of review. And so there's all kind of discussion of how many levels of review, but we came up with 3. And a level 1 is like an initial study of scoping. We do a little work to see if this site will provide paleo flood estimates. And it involves few personnel, kind of a feasibility study. And then you can move on to a study that is more detailed, involves more people, involves more money. And then the level 3 is like regional and site specific, involves a number of sites, reaches, a multidisciplinary team, more layers of review in the process. And that's like the gold standard. if you were building a nuclear power plant, that's probably what you would want to do, but you actually might start with a level 1 study just to see the feasibility of looking for paleo data. So a number of publications have come out about this. And if anyone's interested, you could contact me and I can email you the citations. But it was fun to be part of this work for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. There's one I didn't talk about that Tess Harden, who is the lead author for the levels of review one, she and colleagues did physical work to get a 4,000-year record of flooding in the Tennessee River in the United States. So then we've completed some projects in cooperation with the U.S. Department of Transportation, Federal Highway Administration on all these unrelated questions as well, and a post-Bulletin 17C. When the flood regime is changing, what's causing that change? How do we adjust flood frequencies for that change? So first we worked on detecting changes, gradual trends, abrupt changes, change points, and then increases in flooding, where you don't just have one annual big flood, maybe you have multiple floods per year. And then we looked at attribution, what is causing these, and then how do we adjust flood frequency analysis? And this goes back to Bulletin 17C, which assumes stationarity, but that we need to go beyond those methods when we have sites where there's change going on. And we were influenced by research of others in this, including a paper by Souris that said, regardless of perceived non-stationarity, whether due to ongoing changes of the physical characteristics of the basin, we need to investigate the deterministic mechanism that explains the non-stationary behavior. And work by Sarah Noldy, Luke, and others, kind of this sense that you can't just declare a site non-stationary and do some other form of analysis. You need to figure out the physical mechanism and have a justification for doing this analysis. So these are some papers that informed some thinking on this Federal Highway Administration project. And the first part was detecting flood change. And we had this project team, some people I've mentioned before, like Julie Kang, but also Stacey Archfield, Glenn Hodgkins, Rob Dudley of the USGS, and Annalise Bloom, who did a postdoc at the USGS. And we looked at, some of that's repetitive, but one of the things we looked at is change points, where there are abrupt changes in the flood distribution. And so there are abrupt changes all over the country. It's one thing to say they exist. It's another thing to try to show what year they existed. And we see some downward changes here. And sometimes they seem random, and sometimes there's spatial cohesiveness to these. And when there's some spatial cohesiveness, it's maybe a climate issue. In the 60s, there were some dry areas. As we move into the 1970s, we see a lot of increases in peak stream flow, particularly in the eastern United States, and the distribution shifted up. We see in southeastern United States periods where flow shifted down, and there's been a general drying in that issue. As we move into the 1990s, we'll see the interior of the continent light up with blue upward triangles, indicating the distribution shifted up, and the Red River, the North Basin, just the whole distribution shifted up, and there were 2 decades of large floods there. So there's a lot of spatial cohesiveness as to when these change points occur. We also see some random variation, which can indicate when our dam went in or there was some localized land use issue. That's just one piece of what we did in that detection part. And then we looked at attribution, and this is the team that looked at attribution, subject matter experts across the country. We had 7 regional teams dig into all of these results from the detection and try to figure out what was causing these changes. And we, here's the 7 regions we came up with in the United States. And we used a multiple working hypothesis framework to come up with all these possible reasons, to try to have a consistent vocabulary, what might be causing changes in annual peak stream flow. And we came up with a lot of possibilities, including unknown in some cases, including the very rare volcanic activity from one of our scientists in Montana because of changes to a river coming out of Yellowstone National Park. And then we came up with a vocabulary, looking at climate literature, looking for robust, saying that there was robust evidence for the change attribution that we made, medium, limited, additional information required. And we worked on tables like this where we had a gauge, there was an increasing trend. We think it's because of an increase in long-term precipitation. How confident are we about that? And then some notes on our attribution. And this is an example from the Upper Plains region. So this is the Missouri River Basin and the Souris Red Rainy in the interior of North America. And we did some cluster analysis, and they're distinct clusters of different kinds of changes. Like this blue in the eastern part is generally an increase in precipitation. Down here, the pinker colors in Nebraska and Kansas, there's a decline in peak streamflow, and there's a decline in general in streamflow related to irrigation, groundwater pumping, surface water, groundwater interaction, and then we see different patterns in the mountains in the west. So this is a very heterogeneous area. It was kind of fascinating to look at. And then these are the kinds of things we dug into at a particular site. There, and in the region, there is a change point that occurs downward flow abruptly, 1972 to 79, depending on the site. One site in particular has been the subject of a number of research papers, and they dug into water permits, rainfall runoff modeling to try to figure out what was going on here. And they found that there was an increased winter atmospheric evaporative demand. And in this separate study, they found a change point essentially at the same time we did. And they did a lot of the background work for us to look at water permits and all kinds of things. And they found a 46% decrease in annual peak streamflow in the 1970s. And we found a similar thing. So that's the kind of things we dug into for that. And then the last piece of the project, which is still is not published yet, but about to be, is to look at methods to adjust flood frequency analysis for these changes. And Jory Hecht and Nancy Barth did the majority of the technical work on this. And they looked at site flood frequency analysis of sites all across the conterminous United States and looking at different types of changes in annual peak streamflow, thinking about physical covariates and looking at the 100-year floods, but also the more frequent floods, the kinds of things where entities involved in transportation might be concerned about culverts and small bridges, and looked at a number of different kinds of methods. If you just use Bulletin 17C, if you use various other forms of linear regression, quantile regression, and other models to try to adjust for this trend, which is a violation of the underlying assumptions of flood frequency analysis, and come up with a better way to estimate flood magnitudes. And also, notably, sometimes the change wasn't really happening in the 100-year floods. It's happening in the more frequent lower level floods. So there are different ways to deal with different parts of the flow regime. And we compared different trend models to adjust for trends in the mean and or variance, to look at different quantiles of the floods, and did Monte Carlo experiments to find the best method. And one of the difficulties with non-stationary flood frequency analysis, there's no one best method that's going to work for everybody. Depends on what's going on at your gauge, what the physical reason for the change is. There's a lot of work that remains to be in this area, and to make these methods accessible to practitioners, that's an ongoing concern. You can come up with a fantastic statistical model, but if people don't understand it, if it's difficult to apply, that's an ongoing concern. So the attribution work is this 8-chapter professional paper. There were journal articles that came out on the detection of the trends. The attribution is still pending USGS publication, should come out in the next couple months. The journal article, there are some other journal articles I didn't mention, and then the one on adjustment of flood frequency analysis should be coming out very soon. So if you're interested in any of those publications, I can send them to you. And then finally, I wanted to talk about some projects in cooperation with the Transportation Pooled Fund Program. And this is a way for usually state departments of transportation to pay in money into a fund to address a problem. And so we have all of the 9 state agencies and then 4 USGS water science centers covering generally, vaguely the Midwestern United States. And we're all working together to try to figure out how to do better flood estimation in the future. One of the driving reasons for this is if you look at the interior of the continent, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming, and look at trends in annual peak streamflow, this happens to be green means upward, red means downward. There's this distinct difference in what's going on. And this is at about the 100th meridian, which is a line that has been long noted in the United States and Canada as there's a different climate on either side of the line. And we see these very different phenomena. And there was a switch from relatively wet conditions in Wyoming, Montana to drier conditions around 1980. That same switch occurred in the Eastern Dakotas, but in the opposite direction around 1980, where now we have a lot higher flow than we used to. And if you divide those up into 2 periods based on that change point and do flood frequency curves, you actually get 2 quite distinct curves. And that comes back to that sampling issue. What if you based your construction of infrastructure on this blue lower line, but then you shifted into wetter conditions and now you don't have the protection that you thought you had? And that was these examples are one of the driving reasons for this project. Also, another reason was the Souris River Basin of Saskatchewan, North Dakota, and Manitoba. Most of the flood protection or the benefits of Minot, North Dakota, United States is in Canada, and this has created some controversy over the years. Lawsuits over this have helped build the body of Canadian environmental law, and there are 3 books that have been written about this situation. And these were built after some large floods, what we thought were large floods in the 1960s and 70s. But then there was a catastrophic flood in 2011, like nothing we had seen before in a gauged period of record. And so colleagues of mine did a similar thing, dividing this up into a wet and dry period. And this bottom one shows the volume of Rafferty Reservoir at maximum storage capacity, and that's the largest reservoir in Saskatchewan. And if we have 2 volume curves based on the wet and dry period, the red one, it would be extraordinarily rare to exceed the volume of Rafferty Reservoir. If we look at the blue one, it has been exceeded, and we don't have as much flood protection as we thought. And in fact, one of these reservoirs during 2011, they were moving equipment in to intentionally breach it because they thought they were going to lose the dam and wanted to control a failure. Just fortunately, they did not have to do that, but it caused a flood that was devastating to Minot, North Dakota. So there's been a lot of work related to that. And then this is from a colleague in Texas, and he divided the flood regime up into 2 different periods based on antecedent moisture conditions using the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which we think is indicative of dry conditions, but it can also indicate wet conditions. And he gets 2 distinctly different flood frequency analysis curves. So the motivating factors for this Transportation Pooled Fund project are this abrupt increases in flooding that we saw in the Eastern Dakotas into Minnesota, Iowa, decreases in flooding further west. And, some of my colleagues, their concern is the state Department of Transportation overspending on culverts and small bridges. Maybe they could save money. and then changes in land use, tile drainage, and so on. And also trying to understand non-stationarity in this region. And I really like this paper by Razavi and others. And they did work on the Saskatchewan River in Canada with an 89-year period of observational record. And usually we're pretty happy when we have a record that long. But they say that is a poor representation of the long-term properties of the hydrologic regime. And stationarity might never have existed in the hydrology of that region. And that's certainly something we've been thinking about a lot in the interior of the continent. So the scope of this work includes looking at hydroclimatic shifts, looking at stream flow and climate data, and potential reasons for those changes, looking at some seasonality changes of flood peaks, looking at the effect of urbanization, the effect of tile drainage, and then testing, looking at ways to do non-stationary flood frequency analysis. And we have not started that part yet. And there are no publications out yet on these items. There will be in the future. It's kind of an exciting project and a great team of people working on it. And then just there are many other USGS efforts going on related to flooding, skew, an issue I mentioned just briefly. People are still using standard flood frequency analysis because that's the best method we have at the moment. Flood typing, trying to figure out in this long-term record where these snowmelt generated, where they precipitation generated, hurricane generated, so on. Some training efforts, and then working with some tribal indigenous colleges on flood issues in the Northern Great Plains. So if you're interested in any of those publications, I would be happy to email them to you. If you've ever looked at the issue of tile drainage and flooding, which I have some skepticism about, but one of our cooperators wanted us to investigate it, I would love to hear from you if you've ever investigated that. So thank you for this opportunity to speak about all of these studies. I really appreciate the hard work of all of my colleagues and our cooperators that have funded this and been financial and intellectual resources for us.
Thank you very much, Karen, for this very good talk. Gave us a very comprehensive overview of what USGS has been doing. So I open for anyone who wants to make comments or ask questions. I don't know if Eduardo wants to say something, or Jerry, who participate very strongly in the development of the Bulletin 17C.
I think Jerry has the floor. I think he is eager to engage in the discussion, right, Jerry?
Oh, Karen just did a wonderful job of describing all of the ongoing studies they have, and it's really great that was both in 17C and some of the other work, much of which was done by USGS personnel, that we provided, the concept's been provided in the software in some cases to do these things. She and Bob Hirsch, I know, worked a lot on climate change, and that's a real problem. So when people challenge me on that, I say, well, you know, I did what I could. It's up to the next generation like Karen. Some of the stuff we did decades ago seems naive now, but we didn't have the evidence of climate change, and in particular, we have so much more atmospheric information that we know that the context of the Earth system is changing, and the challenge is to try and work that out. Was Cliff Hupp involved in the botanical investigations that you mentioned?
I remember hearing his name in discussions, but he was not directly involved.
Well, really nice job. Thank you for summarizing it.
And thank you for your comments. I know some people wished Bulletin 17C had gone further to address some of these things, but then it probably still wouldn't be out. These are difficult issues, and the advancement in Bulletin 17C to have the thresholds, the intervals, and the PILFs, the influential low flows, those were great advancements, and so I'm glad it came out.
Eventually.
Yeah, it was a long drawn out process too.
Karen, just a curiosity, the attribution study that you guys are doing, it intends to guide some policy in terms of what kind of actions those states should be implementing in the field, in the ground.
Well, we have to be careful in the USGS what we say about guiding policy. So it would inform states potentially, but also our thinking was that it would inform future choices of non-stationary flood frequency analysis methods, because the same method is not going to work for all conditions as we know more about the complexity of changes. And so it gets back to some of those papers that talked about we need to know about the physical mechanism that is causing the change, and then that can inform what we do in analysis and planning and adaptation response.
I think Macedo wants to say something. Dario?
Hi.
Hello.
Are you listening?
Yes.
Hi, Carrie. I'm Dario. I'm water resources researcher at FUNSEMI, and I like to ask you, what do you think about the flood frequency studies that use the people memories to estimate the flood level at periods and watershed with no stream flow measurements? Do you think that it just adds another uncertainty element in this study?
So there was a word or two I missed in there. The flood frequency studies that use what?
Personal memories.
Oh, personal memories. Okay.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of interest in that in the United States of using Native American or indigenous records. In some cases, they may have oral traditions, or the Dakota people of the Great Plains, where I'm from, had a winter count, which was an annual painting essentially on a big buffalo hide, and the biggest event of the year essentially was depicted, and sometimes those were floods, and so there's interest in incorporating that kind of uncertainty. You need to have some sense of magnitude, like it was less than this flood that happened before, it was bigger than this flood that happened 10 years later. You need to get some sense of the magnitude, and sometimes that can be difficult. You just know it was big, but you don't have the magnitude. But there is a lot of potential for that, and it's a case where maybe the personal histories, the oral tradition point you to a site where you could do some paleo flood work to find physical evidence of that flood, which would then help you define the flood. Of course, that is expensive. It can take a lot of money to do those paleo flood studies. And we also know that personal histories, newspaper accounts, diaries can exaggerate floods too, because if you live through something catastrophic to your community, you want others to understand what a big deal it was. And so sometimes those get exaggerated. And so again, if you can find multiple lines of evidence, some physical evidence to go along that, but certainly it is an area where
Thank you.
That's an interesting question, Dario. During my PhD thesis here, and I worked on the development of a method to try to incorporate the uncertainty in the Paleoflood or the historical floods. So if you have an idea, the uncertainty on that information, you can take into account in the flood frequency analysis, which is good. But it's hard sometimes to describe certain that information. That's the problem.
Yes.
But once you have that information, an idea of that information, you can take into account in the analysis. I was also very interested in the attribution study that you showed. So I will probably contact you later to know more about who is doing what and how, because we have just finished, well, we finished like more than a year ago, large study in the detection of trends in various indices of flow And I have been trying to understand why those trends were detected, trying to attribute those changes to some physical reasons. And it's not that easy, especially here in Brazil, because our record lengths are not that long, so it's not very easy to come up to obtain a very precise relationship between those possible physical factors and the trends themselves. But I would like to know more about how you're doing this. So I'll probably contact your colleagues about that. I was talking to Eduardo behind the scenes about that, and he mentioned that we may initiate a research project on that, at least in the national scale. We use more than 1,000 gauges in this study, so we have a kind of good understanding of what's going on, but we need to understand why we are seeing what it is. Any more questions or comments here? Let me check that YouTube channel if there is something here.
Karen, I wanted to note that you showed a graph related to the Nuclear Regulatory Agency study of what happened when you fit different distributions. And I don't think you did anything wrong at all, but I think without more explanation, it exaggerates the effect of distribution choice, because it seemed clear that some of those distributions weren't necessarily going to be appropriate, and other cases, some of them just didn't even fit the systematic record. It was like they were supposed to be turning left and they were turning right. But there's certainly the point that choice of distribution matters more than you get in the tail. But yeah, there it was.
Yeah, I went through that pretty quickly.
The generalized Pareto down there.
Yes.
With using this graph and looking at the larger floods, not just the two largest, but the other, you can see that some of these are just going in the wrong way.
Yes, that's a good point.
And I mean, my thesis, which or comment about these studies is that generally, if you, in my opinion, you restrict the analysis to distributions that are fitting the data well, the important difference is not between distributions, it's the uncertainty for any distribution, because they're all based on a limited set of record. And so you understand this very well, and I think this graph serves you poorly.
Thank you for pointing that out. Yes. This was a case study. It was done at just 2 sites. So they chose to do all the distributions and different fitting methods at both sites. But as you said, like right away, you could discount some of these and not use them.
Well, I mean, the problem is the lesson's wrong. Because they're trying, or the fun, just as you want to know the basis of why we're seeing these changes, it seems to me there's huge uncertainty, but it's because of the limited record. This overestimates it because of models, many of which aren't appropriate. I mean, you've been involved in all of this, and Eduardo's PhD thesis had a wonderful set of papers that came out on the GEV distribution, which is used very widely, and but you're fitting a 3-parameter GV and a 3-parameter Pearson type 3, it's amazing how much they can fit the same. So the issue becomes the data, not the choice of distribution.
Right. And if you really want to go this far out on the tails, you should really have some paleo data to help weight the tail better, because there's not much information out here.
And I was out in Denver 2 weeks ago with John England, and they have Best Fit, which is a new software program that they put out, which uses maximum likelihood. Well, it's Bayesian, but it's based on the likelihood function, which of course Gersau used in his PhD thesis when he was looking at the fact that there's error in your gauge, would get your transformation of gauge height to flow. And they don't quite have that in there yet. They'll catch up to Dressel soon, I'm sure. But that's nice because they use that to use regional regression, which both Eduardo and Dressel have in their theses, to give them an estimate of sort of a regionalization of what larger quantiles might be. And so they take the regional regression model and get an estimate of I think they were using the 50-year flood and its uncertainty, and then that is information into a Bayesian model. Of course, it would be nice to do all this with Bayesian statistics, but we got started with classical statistics at the turn of the previous century, and it's hard to.
Yes, I've seen a presentation on that Corps of Engineer software, but I've never dug into it. It certainly presentation was very interesting.
Well, it's very new and they don't have a lot of documentation yet. Most of the documentation seems to be more how to run it than to explain what it's doing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But anyway, very nice presentation. You brought a lot together. The survey is doing an incredible amount of stuff, as well as trying to polish the two programs that do EMA. Your agency, the GS and the Corps, each have an implementation of the software, and they're meeting regularly to try to iron out a lot of these issues of how to run it, and as you described for the regulatory agency, what are the guidelines for how to do this and that. I was a little concerned when you talked about historical information being biased. When Tim and I first presented this idea of using historical information, we were criticized that you couldn't use historical information for frequency analysis because it was biased. You only saw the big floods. Okay. And of course, it's correct in the fact that you can't treat them as if they were just regular observations. They were observed because they were big. And you were very good at emphasizing that what to make it work, you needed to have what Vic Baker called catalog complete, which is some description of in every year. And you did a wonderful job of that. What you did say was they were biased because people's oral accounts or written accounts exaggerated what had actually happened. So you weren't making the argument that Jim Wallace made that I couldn't use historical information because they were big floods. Which was the point.
Right. There's different forms of bias that go into that discussion. And some people have done some research to try to found that some newspaper accounts were biased. But and that's another issue. Like in the USGS database, where there are historical floods, they've been entered as a point estimate because that database was created in the 1960s and you were concerned about every character of data taking up more space. Historical data should be recorded, entered, used as an interval estimate if you calculate it properly or reasonably to address that greater uncertainty in those estimates.
Well, with things like the best fit from the Corps and extensions of EMA are certainly possible as well. It doesn't have to be just an interval like it's a uniformly distributed in there. One hopefully will see that become a little more sophisticated. Same thing when providing errors on slope area estimates, which clearly have error too. How to do that. So there's still a lot of things we can do just trying to analyze correctly series assuming stationarity. And then lots of people have done work, and you're one of them, trying to come to grips with non-stationary. Let me just tell you a story that augments what you said. There's a statement that you showed the quota from Bulletin 17C, and as we were trying to close the door on that, fix it, the Corps of Engineers was particularly concerned that we were not endorsing what to do if things were non-stationary. They had funding, and that was a big interest. And so Tim Cohn and I went from the National Center, where I was on sabbatical for the GS, down to IWR for the Corps, their Think Center, and had a Zoom meeting when the Bureau was out in Denver someplace. And we came up with that statement, which Bob Hirsch edited later to he wanted it to make it sound that nobody made a mistake, which it was implied in the words we chosen. But basically, it was, as you said, we were trying to finish Bulletin 17C. We didn't want to wait another 20 years until everybody agreed on how to treat non-stationarity. So we said, look, we understand this is a problem. Not everywhere is stationary. If you can figure out what's going on and document it and prove it, then you should go ahead and do that. And this is where we're going to start. And I couldn't believe it. Of course, okay, that's fine. We'll support it now in the Bureau too. And so we had that one meeting with Tim Cohn and Rolf Olson from the Corps, and I forgot who from the Bureau was involved. But anyway, we got that done. You were very kind and complimentary for that, because if you think about the frequency in the US, they got out the first copy of this in 76 and made modest revisions in 82, and so it wasn't until 2018 that we got another version out. And the 80s and early 90s were a period of amazing work on flood frequency analysis across the globe. All kinds of people put things in, and Index Flood, which was Wallace and Hosking and Metalis from the survey, and Langmuir from the survey. We're all participating in that. And in the US, we didn't make any progress at all. But on the other hand, we back in 82 said you ought to use regional skew, which is a regional method. So we didn't have to respond as fast because we were 2 decades ahead of everybody else. But things didn't evolve. And in particular, the troubling thing was until 2018, people were using the same skew map Hardison from the survey did in 75. And Tim had the original map. I hope somebody like Robert Mason has it now. But then we've got Gersau on here, and in his thesis and his work, we were really pushing redoing skew map with a statistically sound spatial statistical method. So here's the survey. Andrea Veyu is now doing that. She's about halfway through the US, trying to provide good estimates of a skew that are statistically sound. And so we're sort of doubling at least the effective record length of the regional skew and finding other problems. So that was nice job, Karen. You forgot to attribute the beautiful picture of Paleo information, which I have that exact slide in my presentation, but I note that it was due to Bob Jarrett doing a redraw of a Vic Klimisch figure.
Oh, okay. This one?
All I see is Zoom.
Oh,
Não, agora eu tô falando
But it's the one with the trees and the slack water deposits and the river basin. So there it is. I criticized you severely for not citing where you stole them.
I think it is in this report now, and it's probably cited in the report. Yeah.
Well, if that's the only error or problem you had, you're doing incredibly well.
Gary, I have one more question, one final question. It's from Renan Rocha. He's in the YouTube channel. He's not here in the Zoom. He wants to know what method you use to carry out the trend detection study, and if you try to estimate how confident you were on those estimates, something like that. I'm not sure if you know how to answer.
Yes,
estimar os estimadores. Não sei se é bem isso, mas
okay. So on the trend detection piece, we looked at gradual trends, monotonic trends, using the Mann-Kendall trend test. And so I don't know everybody's background in statistics in the audience, but linear regression is often used for trends. But because of the skew and annual peak streamflow, even after you take the logarithms of it, linear regression is not always the best method, and you can have high and low outliers.
I think Renan knows that very well.
Okay, and so we use the Mann-Kendall trend method, and Glenn Hodgkins and Rob Dudley did that work in conjunction with a colleague of Rob's in Europe who had looked at ways to adjust the method for serial correlation. So they looked into that question a little bit. They found generally across the United States, serial correlation wasn't a big issue. And so they didn't make too much of the adjustment. But in the interior of the continent, where I've done a lot of work, like the Red River in the United States and Canada, serial correlation is an issue. And there are a number of methods for man-Kendall to adjust for that serial correlation. And the person that asked the question could email me and I could send them some information about that. And then when we looked for abrupt changes, change points, I led that paper, and Glenn and Rob were part of that. And there are a ton of change point methods out there. That's how people get a PhD in statistics. They come up with and so I was very interested in testing these methods because the Pettit test has been around for a long time. It's been used a lot in hydrology. It only detects one change point. And I know with some of these long records, Red River being one of them, there are in some cases multiple change points related to precipitation that you can be confident that yes, there was a change here. So I thought we should use a method that detects multiple changes. And I simulated random data with statistical properties of peak stream flow and inserted change points. And we tested a number of methods. And the Corps has done Corps of Engineers did some similar work too that informed ours. And what we found with these multiple change point methods, the false positive rate is really high. Even in a randomly generated data set, they find multiple change points. And so if you really know the site well and you know what is going on, you can use those methods to help justify your choice of change points. But if you are just doing this across the country and you can't study every site, the false positive rate is too high for those when you find multiple change points. So what we found, the best method of the ones we tested was the Pettit test, kind of the status quo. So it was an interesting test.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I would like to thank you, Carrie, again for accepting the invitation. You gave a very good talk. Thank you, everyone here. I don't know if Eduardo wants to say final words to close.
So just to thank Carrie and also our invited guest, Richardton, to be here. He is one of the guys that did a lot of contribution on Politique 17. And it's nice to see the work paying off, right, Jared?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's good to see you, Jared. Here.
He didn't hesitate, Karen. When he heard that you were talking, okay, I will cancel my dentist appointment. So it was very nice for him and for you as well to be here with us. It's early stage of this initiative, but I think it will be nice for people from Brazil and other places that we have networked with to be a part of this kind of discussions. Thank you very much, Karen.
Thank you for the invitation. And I hope you can get your appointment rescheduled without too much trouble, Jared.
Oh, no, just an announcement. Karen is going to give a talk next week for Anna. So I think someone who works for Anna knows the link to, if you're interested, she's going to be talking about water quality, right, Karen?
Yes.
We can share to the channel Papa Connexus, the link, and then I will talk with Saul about it. Okay.
If you guys want a pre-Bulletin 17C talk, I have one that goes through and relates the history of the development of Bulletin 17 and what those innovations were, which Karen did a very nice job of reviewing.
Gary, the invitation was just the excuse to see how interested you still participate in this kind of discussion. So this is already in the agenda. Don't worry, you will not escape from us.
Well, Karen did a great job. I'm meeting weekly with the USGS and the Army Corps of Engineers, which has two teams that are working on improvements in Bulletin 17C software, the EMA software.
No, I mean, your invitation to this talk is to see if you're still interested in engaging this kind of discussion, because I intend to call you on other topic to discuss with us.
Okay. Well, this is Karen's day. Let's not talk about me.
Yeah. But I really appreciate Karen. It was very nice work. I was impressed with the comprehensive presentation that you gave, and the amount of work of USGS is doing in this scope is really amazing. I wish we can do something similar or close to it here in Brazil. It's amazing talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to summarize all that USGS work. It was nice making all of these connections.
Thank you very much.
Bye bye, gente.
Okay, bye bye.